Desirable. Shifter's Forever Worlds Book 15 by Elle Thorne.
Chapter 1. You're not going to invite them. You can't. Evie stomped her foot, eyes flashing. Lézare Arsenault held back a laugh. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate his little sister's angst. He'd suffered his own share of heartbreak. Hell, he was still living in heartache. That's what you get for falling for a woman you can't have. He forced a stoic expression onto his face while a battle raged on within him. His tiger knew the one for him. Lézare was attracted to that woman. God knew this Arsenault man was more than smitten, but what was he to do when she had no interest in him? She refused to regard him as anything other than the enemy who thwarted her plans. Evangeline. He put a hand on her shoulder. Evie, Evangeline Arsenault was a hot-headed one. He had to admit all his sisters were. Such temperamental creatures, white tigresses, stubborn and beautiful. They took after their mother, curvy and dark-haired but with varying degrees of burnished copper highlights. Those were courtesy of their mother's gene pool as well. Simmer. He pulled her close for a hug. Surely you can manage a little party, and not let his being there bother you. Lézare. Cher. He had a habit of using his mother's French, though truth be told, he knew he butchered the language horribly. However, it didn't deter him. He had the accent down pat, even if he couldn't say the words with the precision the glorious language required. It wasn't easy juggling a southern accent with a French twist. Look, he continued. It's a big house. That wasn't an exaggeration. Arsenault Point was huge. It stood on a former plantation, originally owned by the man who'd held their father's people as slaves, long ago, before his great-great-grandfather Etienne could pass for white. Etienne had built a life for himself elsewhere, far from Louisiana, never once whispering of his slave heritage, allowing his white gene pool to dictate the course of his life and the path of today's Arsenault clan. Lézare's great-great-grandfather had been one of the rare shifters who wasn't born a shifter. He'd been turned. How he was turned was a secret he'd carried to his grave, saying that the world had enough shifters. Etienne had fled after he was turned, built a life in the north, and returned decades later as a wealthy, successful, and unmated shifter. Etienne had two goals when he returned. The first was to eradicate the bloodline of the people who'd held his people as slaves. The second was to take over their home. And that was how the Arsenault home, Arsenault Point, became theirs. What Etienne hadn't planned on. Something that changed the course of Arsenault history. When he snuck into the room of the Arsenault's 22-year-old, auburn-haired only child Celine, he'd planned to take her life. It was to be the ultimate revenge. She was the last of the Arsenault. The unplanned part. The way she'd made him feel. She'd captured his heart and made it hers as securely as if she'd shackled it. Celine's father gave her hand away to the man he thought was a northerner, and died never knowing Etienne was not only a former slave of, but also a descendant of his own ancestors. He never learned Etienne had left decades ago, after being turned into a shifter in the swamps of Louisiana. That former slave had become the owner and the patriarch of a formidable set of shifters at Arsenault Point. Lézare. Evie interrupted his musings. I don't care how big the house is. I don't even want to be in the same state as Mason Martinez. Her face flamed crimson with fury. Why did our cousin have to go and mate with his brother? I'm so mad at Vela. Lézare did laugh this time. I'm sure a 30,000-square-foot house is big enough for you to go hide in, since you don't want to see your former beau. Lézare had never left Louisiana, unlike his sisters, who'd spent a lot of their time in boarding schools and out of state at college. His accent was far more pronounced for the area, the letter T often dropping off his contractions. He noticed the differences between their speech most when he was around his sisters. Could have had something to do with the amount of time I spent with my grandfather, he mused, who spoke the same way. It's not funny. She punctuated each of her words with a fist to his arm. On the last one, he reached out, his tiger reflexes supernaturally fast, and caught her fist in his hand. Enough. He moved her fist to her side, his grip on it firm until she unclenched it. You can be a cordial hostess, or you can be absent. They are family now, too. Family mattered to Lézare. It mattered greatly. His father had been a distant cousin to Vax and Vela Tiero's mother. After her death, Lézare and his sisters had been forbidden to associate with Vax and Vela by Vax's father, Giovanni Tiero. Gio's orders and mission were clear. He wanted the Tieros to have nothing to do with the Arsino, nothing to do with his dead wife's side of the family, which was open to diversity among shifters. For Giovanni Tiero, tigers belonged with tigers, lions with lions, and so on and so forth. To him, the worst infraction of all was mating with humans, which Gio's own son Vax had done. The old code brewed bitterness in Lézare's gut. What's that look about? Alexa, who'd been quietly observing Evie's tantrum, finally spoke. What look? He wiped his scowl away. She shook her head. He and Alexa were the closest of all the siblings. Second in birth order, after Lézare, she was also second in charge of the Arsino organization. She was an alpha in her own right, and brooked little dissension. Evie. Alexa addressed their younger sibling. You'll have to figure something out. Mark and Vela are invited, and so is Mason. What you and he had in college, however it may have ended, is in the past. You cannot disrupt this occasion, as you did the Shifter Council meeting. She softened her diatribe with a smile. The Arsino Shifter Masquerade Ball only happens once a year. Why do I have to do that? It's our party. It's an Arsino event, Evie huffed. Her claws extended as ire pushed her toward a shift. With a slight creaking sound, she shifted into her white tigress, turned back, snarled at her siblings, and left the room in 2 long jumps, bounding out of sight. That went well. Lézare took a beignet from the tray. Maylene, the housekeeper, had slipped the still warm concoctions onto the table in the midst of their melee, then left without a word, with only a furtive glance at Lézare. Real well. Alexa's voice held as much sarcasm as his own. She glanced at her phone, then frowned, her brows dipping in a stern V. Nothing. Not a word. Not a text. Not a call. Unlike Valencia. Valencia, the youngest of Lézare's sisters, was en route from Georgia. Maybe we should be happy she's not texting and driving. Lézare took a bite, careful not to breathe out so the confectioner's sugar wouldn't scatter. Lézare. Alexa stared out the front window. Someone's here. Lézare put the beignet on the plate. Who is it? I don't recognize the vehicle. She frowned. Change that. I don't recognize either of them. We're expecting at least a dozen or so who'll be staying on the premises instead of in the city. It's no surprise vehicles are pulling up. By the city, he meant New Orleans. He approached his sister, put his arm around her. What's going on? I'm sensing something's up with you, Alexandria. She gave him a mock dirty look at his use of her full name. He hadn't planned on using her nickname. He simply wasn't a nickname kind of guy. Nothing. I've got this feeling. Maybe it's stress or Evie and Mason. She needs to relax. He glanced out the window at the sizable staircase leading to the landing at the top of the stairs at the front door. Half a dozen of his security team had already opened the door and were awaiting the new arrivals. Lézare's security team was much more than just security. They were his associates, his backup, his muscle. Fiercely loyal to Lézare, they were available in any capacity they were needed. Their lead, Theo, glanced at the window where Lézare was standing and gave him a subtle nod. Lézare acknowledged the nod with a slight inclination of his own head. Lézare, I don't think you understand the depth of their feelings. You've never been in. She may not have finished her sentence, but he knew what she was going to say, that he'd never been in love. He bit back a response. Just because he didn't advertise his feelings didn't mean he had none. They wouldn't like his choice in women anyway. If they have feelings for one another, they should act on them. He was one to speak. He wasn't acting on his desires or feelings. The door on one of the Suburbans opened. Alexa squealed and bounced up and down. Lézare flinched and covered the ear nearest to her. "It's Callie." Her voice was a high-pitched screech of jubilation. His cousin Vax, Vittorio Tiero, was helping his mate Callie out of the vehicle. She was nearing the final stages of her pregnancy. "You didn't tell me Vax and Callie were coming." Alexa was still squealing in his ear. He stepped away from her and the din she was letting loose. Who would have thought such a short package of a woman could be capable of such volume? He wasn't sure he'd make it. He said it would depend on Callie and the baby. "She looks like she might have it any time now." Lézare scowled at his sister. "We're not equipped to have a birth here." Was Vax crazy, bringing his pregnant mate so far from Dallas? She might give birth at the Arsenault plantation home, a good 30-minute ride from the city, and who knew how far away from a qualified obstetrician. It wasn't like she'd be giving birth to just any child. She was carrying a shifter's baby. What sort of issues could her delivery be plagued with? The other doors on that Suburban, and the second one, opened. Lézare stepped away from Alexa, because he knew if he didn't, she'd blow out his eardrum. Sure enough, she started to squeal again, hopping around. Vela Tiero and Mark Martinez stepped onto the driveway. Right behind them, Cy helped Lila out. From the second Suburban, Doc and May exited. Lézare exhaled a sigh of relief. Doc was here. He could deliver the baby if something happened. Gavin helped Layla out of the same vehicle Doc and May had been in. Lézare turned to Alexa. "No, Sophie." Lézare knew that Alexa had a special relationship with Sophie. Alexa had helped Sophie hide her pregnancy, and she had been the only one Sophie had told about it. Of course, when Alexa needed help, she'd had to bring Lézare in, but he'd kept Sophie's secret, even kept it from her entire family, including Vax, whom he was very close to. It was Sophie's secret to tell. She decided to stay abroad a while. "She'll be back." Lézare nodded. "If Gavin, Vax, and Vela are here, that means Dane's running the place." Lézare was happy. He liked the Black Panther. He'd heard rumors about Dane's early years. The shifter was due a good life. "Let's go greet our family." Alexa tugged on his sleeve. "Notice something?" he asked her. She glanced back. "What?" "No, Mason." Her lips parted, her mouth making a perfect letter O. "I wonder how Evie's going to take that." She didn't want him here, remember? Lézare shook his head. "Women. So confusing." "Yes, but she doesn't want that to be his decision, I'm sure." He ran his hand over his 2-day growth of beard, scratching at the roughness. "She needs to get her head checked." "Oh, Lézare." He held up a finger for silence. "Please don't feel the need to tell me I know nothing about love again." "Let's go see our guests," she harumphed, but her lips twitched with a smile for her big brother. Chapter 2. Cousin. Lézare opened his arms, greeting his cousin Vax, also a white tiger shifter like himself. They hugged, shoulder to shoulder. "Your mate grows more beautiful every time I see her." Lézare pulled Callie in for a hug. "Oh, you're such a flirt." Callie laughed him off, though a blush kissed her cheeks. "When will you give us that baby to spoil?" He held her hand and stepped back, admiring the fullness of the baby within. "Hopefully, not while I'm here. But just in case." She glanced at Doc Evans. One hand holding his mate May's hand, Doc raised the other hand to his brow in a playful salute. "Traveling obstetrician at your service." May laughed. A flash of indigo gleamed in the depths of her eyes, and a sudden gust of wind blew on the sunny day. Doc gave her a sideways glance. "Control yourself." "It's not me. It's her," May said. Lézare had heard she had an elemental inside her that controlled the weather. "You must tell me more of this." He hugged May, then shook Doc's hand. "Vax mentioned the elemental the last time we spoke." Lézare stopped talking when he noticed a shadow cross May's face. Everyone was suddenly silent, as if he'd brought up a subject that was not to be discussed. Lézare's gaze traveled from one to the next, taking in all the newcomers. May gave a terse little laugh. Sorry. I overreact sometimes. Lézare didn't buy her response. He was grateful she was willing to overlook his faux pas, though he had no idea what he'd said that was wrong. He'd make it a point to ask Vax later. Alexa, Vela, and Lila were clustered around Callie, whispering about her pregnancy. Callie grabbed May's hand and brought her into their tight circle. Where's Evie? Vax asked. And Valencia. Lézare looked at Mark. Evie's sulking. Mason. Vax glanced at Mark as well. Lézare nodded. Is Mason not coming? Not that I don't want him to. The more the merrier is my thought, but she's got. He wanted to say issue, but tried to think of another word. She's got concerns. Mark joined them. Mason does as well. And what about Valencia? Will we get to see our elusive cousin? Vax inquired. She's on the way, driving back from Georgia. Hates flying. Refuses to get into a plane. She said cats weren't meant to be airborne, even if they are shifters. Lézare laughed. How's Callie? Doc asked Vax as he approached the circle of men. She looks well. Vax smiled. She's great. Baby's great. Everything's great. It doesn't appear the trip to Europe did her a disservice, Doc commented. Lézare gauged the happy expression on his cousin's face. And things between you and your brother? Vax and his brother Rafe had been more like rivals and enemies than friends for years. Lézare knew their issues began because of their father Giovanni Tiero, but he'd hoped they'd become close one day. Got back from Rome not long ago. Vax paused, rubbed his jaw, his eye on Callie. Lézare waited, hoping for good news. Things are better. While Callie was visiting with Jax, he and I had some time to reflect on a lot. And Lézare prompted him. It's been resolved. So things are good, does that sum it up? It does. Vax laughed, then lowered his voice when Callie looked in their direction. Callie's happy. It's weighed on her that Rafe and I had issues. Comes from not having a family. Movement caught Lézare's eye. He glanced at one of the windows and saw the blinds move. Evie's room. Sometimes it would be easier not to have a family, wouldn't it? Vax followed Lézare's gaze. Evie. His voice was so low Lézare almost didn't hear him, even with his shifter hearing. Yes, he whispered back, his voice equally low. So, how many are invited? Callie approached Lézare. Invited. Or responded. Or how many do I actually expect? Lézare grinned. All of the above. I invited 200, knowing full well at least 50 couldn't make it, but they'd be insulted if they didn't get invited. I received 65 RSVPs. A few dozen declined, and I'm expecting another 2 or 3 dozen will show up because that's what always happens. It's been happening for as long as I can remember. How long have you had the ball? Vela stepped into the circle, joined by the other women. Alexa stepped forward. The Masquerade Ball is the highlight of Escape Weekend. It's the last event, not counting the brunch we served the morning after the ball. Escape Weekend began when our great-great. She turned to Lézare. How many greats? 3 or 4? Lézare held up 2 fingers. Yes, that's right. Our great-great-grandfather Etienne started it after he'd taken the last descendant of the Arsenault, his arch-enemies, as a bride. That's incredible. Callie's eyes had gone wide. You should ask Lézare to tell you the story sometime. Etienne's son, our ancestor, told it to him before he was killed. Lézare has remembered it word for word. Lézare laughed. I cheated. I transcribed it, but I'm glad to share. He never tired of Etienne's story of retribution, adversaries, and ultimately love. Sometime. Right now, let's get everyone set up in their cabins. Yes. Alexa jumped with glee. The cabins from more than a century ago have been preserved. They were the cabins of our people. Half our people lived in the main house, half in the cabins. Isn't that a sad reminder for you? Callie's eyes clouded with sympathy. Alexa sighed. It was difficult when I was younger. If we tear them down, then we'll have nothing to remind us of the strength of our people. Of Etienne, of his family before him. Lézare nodded. So they stay. And we use them once a year, during escape weekend. That's it. I love the history. Vela took Mark's hand. Will we get to stay in one? It's up to you, main house or a cabin. Your family and family gets first choice. Cabin, Callie exclaimed. Wait. Vax took her hand. What if you need help? You'd be a good distance from the house. May looked at Doc, a worried expression on her face, then back at Callie. Couldn't we stay nearby, at the nearest one? Just in case. An indigo flash coursed through her eyes. Before Doc could respond, a distant thunder rumbled, and a set of clouds formed a few miles away. May's elemental was projecting May's emotions again. Of course, Doc answered with a slight headshake at his mate's weather control. We'll be in the nearest cabin. They're not far apart, are they? A few feet away. You'll feel crowded out there, Lézare responded. He'd never enjoyed staying in the cabins. He'd tried once when he was young. His grandfather had taken him down the week before escape weekend. That was Lézare's first and only time. So, what exactly do we do during escape weekend? And who did the planning and all the work? There's a company we've used for more than 100 years. The owners aren't uncomfortable with shifters. They provide the wait staff, the food, housekeeping, even the entertainment if we want it. Are they shifters? Is that why they're not uncomfortable with us? No. Lézare closed his mouth. He wasn't sure if he should even discuss the other supernatural beings that existed. Lézare. You can't stop at that. Tell them. Alexa prodded him with her elbow. He frowned at his sister. He would share only as much as he needed to. There was no reason to discuss their age-old enemies, the vampires. The owners practice sorcery, might even have an elemental or two amongst them. They cast spells on the humans who work at the event. The humans don't remember what's happened after the week is up. Interesting idea, Gavin said. That's a good way to keep secrets. Alexa gave Lézare a sideways glance. She knew he was holding back. There was no reason to discuss their on and off problems with others, not during the festivities of escape weekend. Let's get you to your cabins. Festivities begin this evening with a cocktail party. Chapter 3. Almost time for the cocktail party. Lézare straightened his tie, then adjusted his jacket. A knock sounded at the door. Enter. He ran his fingers through his hair. He'd kept it short to keep the unruly curls under control, but this was uber short even for him. The door opened, revealing Alexa and Evie, both of them gorgeous in their evening attire, cocktail dresses that rivaled those of royalty, he was certain. Alexa was in black, showcasing the auburn hair she came by naturally. She was the spitting image of the portrait of their great-great-grandmother Celine, the mate of Etienne. The shade of green Evie wore lent a deeper green to her hazel eyes that glowed amber when her tigress's ire had been aroused. Both were in a joyous mood. Their scent and their pulses gave away the adrenaline coursing through their bodies, as it did Lézare's. Escape weekend had always been exciting for the Arsenault siblings. They'd never considered letting the tradition go, though long ago, a family member had said it was dangerous to assemble so many shifters in one location at the same time. That had been proven out over time. Lézare pushed the thoughts away. This wasn't the time to dwell on shifter skirmishes with vampires in his area. And certainly there'd been incidents, but Lézare had plenty of security, overtly and undercover. Threats would be dealt with immediately and severely. Ready? He put his arms out, and each sister grabbed a side. He escorted them down the wide hallway leading to an even wider curving staircase that led to the ballroom, where the cocktail party had already started, though it was unlikely it had gotten into full swing yet. Ready? Evie beamed, clearly thrilled Mason wasn't here, though she couldn't hide the hint of sadness that remained because he'd proven he was strong enough to stay away from her. She'd met him when she went to Florida State to attend college. They'd been a couple for 3 years. Lézare wasn't sure exactly what had split them up, but the moment she'd finished her last final, she'd left town and immediately returned to New Orleans without another word about Mason. "And you?" he asked Alexa. "Are you ready?" She beamed at him. "I was born ready." That was what worried him about this sister of his. She'd accept any challenge, jump into any situation. Hopefully, she'd never jump into one that would leave her wishing she hadn't. He took the steps slowly, as the ladies were in heels, which left him wondering how in the world they managed not to fall. At the base of the stairs, a waiter greeted them with a tray of champagne flutes. The rest of the family was in the room already, along with 3 dozen shifters Lézare had done business with over the years. Many of them lived in the U.S. A few were from Europe, a handful from the Middle East, and some from Africa. No one had a mask on yet, as the only event that required masks was the Masquerade Ball. To prevent any issues, like the ones in 1891 and 1897, all mated and bonded shifters had to wear a wristband made of black satin with a gold stripe running lengthwise down the center. Lézare released himself from his sister's grasps and appraised the room. Damn. 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 No sooner had the thought struck him than Evie whirled on him, her face aflame, her hazel eyes glowing golden fury. "He's here," she hissed. "I see," Lézare responded around the smile he'd plastered on his face. "I thought you said." "I never said anything. I don't know anything. I invited him because I had to. He's family now." "This is unbelievable." Evie's voice was controlled, but Lézare knew her too well. There were tears behind the anger. "My own brother and sister side with anyone but me." Lézare looked at Alexa, pleading with his eyes for her to help him with their sister. Alexa gave him a subtle shrug. "Let me." What could he say? "Let me take care of it. Let me kick the Martinez brother out." He was screwed either way. "Monsieur Arsenault." One of the temporary staff approached him. "You have a phone call. This isn't a good time. Tell them to call back." "I did mention the timing was not good. I was told it was urgent. I'll take it in the den." He exhaled the words on an exasperated breath. This had better not be a last-minute RSVP. He handed the staff member his flute and told his sisters he'd be back shortly. As he departed, Alexa and Evie were hissing at one another about Mason's surprise appearance. Chapter 4. "This better be good," Lézare muttered to himself, then picked up the extension in the study, still able to hear the buzzing of the crowd at the cocktail party. "Lézare Arsenault," he answered. "Arsenault. Natalya's missing. I thought she might have gone to after dark, but they said she wasn't there. I heard that Vax was coming to your place." That voice, one Lézare hadn't heard in months, prompted a drumming of fear in his body. His gut tightened. 1,000,000 of the fire ants that seemed to be overrunning the south chewed on his stomach lining. Was Natalya okay? Had she been hurt? His brief encounter with her had left an indelible mark on him. He couldn't seem to get her off his mind. "She's fine," he tried to convince himself. Of course she was fine. She had to be. If she's fine, then why is her father calling me? He's overreacting. He has to be. Yes, Vax is here. Are you sure she's missing? That she hasn't gone on a shopping spree, or isn't chasing a new boyfriend around town? Just saying those words, the very thought of her involved with someone else, tore through him with the intensity of a welding tool ripping through metal. "I'm certain. She's changed, Arsenault. She hasn't been the same since you returned from your place. She's been concentrating on her studies. No parties. Nothing. She's a different woman. The sound of a ragged breath being drawn came across the connection. I want my daughter back. What if she's been kidnapped? What if she's been taken by the same ones who put on the underground fighting? Would your group be available to help find her? Lézare couldn't see anyone being able to force Natalya to do something she didn't want to do. He thought of the last time he'd seen her. It had taken several of his men to subdue her. He had no doubt she could take care of herself. Then why am I so damned worried? Why does my pulse feel like it's about to go over the cliff? We're really not in the shifter locator business. He had no business looking for her. He had no business wanting that woman. She was trouble. High-spirited, dramatic, and damn her. She was far too sexy, far too desirable. He couldn't deny the attraction. You helped me find her before. I was helping my cousin Vax that day. He felt responsible for her and wanted to be sure she was returned to you unscathed. Arsenault, I'll compensate you handsomely. No promises. Wait. My phone says I have a text. There was a pause. It's from Natalya. It says she's going out of town for the weekend. Oh, then great, we know she's fine. No. I don't trust it. It doesn't sound like her. Listen, I'm telling you, she's not the same woman. I need you to help me. To help her. Did he really want to get involved with searching for her? How the hell was he supposed to get her off his mind if he spent his time looking for her? Tell me the last time you saw her and where. Thank you. Her father's voice was that of a tired old man. So different than the last time Lézare had talked to him.
Chapter 5. Natalya stared at the invitation. She'd read it again and again for weeks, since the day it had arrived at her father's house. It was worn from her fingers, tracing the raised gold lettering, creased from where she'd folded it so she could keep it close all the time. If she didn't have her purse, she carried it in her back pocket. A part of it was stained. Tears she'd shed one day. Silly tears. She tried to think of the girl she used to be. The girl she'd been months ago when she'd first met the man who'd made her shed those tears. She'd been a petulant, petty, vengeful terror then. She'd shown her worst side. She'd been a brat. Her father's brat. When Lézare and his men brought her back to her father's house, she'd stomped her foot and stormed off. Who the hell was I? She didn't like the girl she used to be. Not at all. Shortly afterward, she'd enrolled in several courses at the college, and then, unbeknownst to her father, she'd started working at the homeless shelter on Fridays and Saturdays. Her French-tipped manicure was long gone, replaced by chewed nails on fingers with calluses from wielding a kitchen knife at the shelter. During hour after hour of chopping vegetables, she'd reflected on who she used to be, and began to appreciate the little things in life, such as smile of a child at the shelter when she gave him an extra dessert. Or the appreciative glow on one woman's face when Natalya brought in more than half her wardrobe so the woman would be able to go apply for a job. Natalya actually liked who she was now. She liked the new Natalya a lot. And others did too. She met new friends at the shelter and at school, friends who didn't care that her father was rich, or that he ran a multi-million-dollar corporation and was one of the more powerful shifters in town. Well, actually, they didn't know that last part. She sat behind the wheel of her Acura and studied the invitation, her fingers tingling where they traced Lézare Arsenault's name. Him. He was the one she wanted. And he knew who the real Natalya was. The hot-tempered, impulsive brat he'd met. Except I'm not that person anymore. Much. She was still hot-tempered. Still impulsive and spontaneous. She just wasn't a little shit anymore. Oh, who was she kidding? He wouldn't want her, not when he could have any stunning shifter he wanted. Why would he want her, with her overabundance of curves, her overly full lips, her thick brows and even thicker thighs? Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. She didn't want to look to see who it was. She'd left home, didn't want to talk to anyone, hadn't left a note. Maybe I'm still an inconsiderate brat. I shouldn't worry Poppy like this. She picked up her phone and texted her father a short message saying she was going out of town for the weekend. At least this way, she knew he was aware she was okay. She knew what she had to do. She had to go to Louisiana. She had to go to Arsenault Point. Natalya was an hour away from Austin, an hour into her trip to Louisiana, when she stopped to gas up and grab a bottled water. She'd just buckled her seatbelt and picked up her phone to check the time when she found a text waiting for her. It was from Monica, one of the volunteers at the homeless shelter. Monica, Ms. Claudette won't eat dinner. She's refusing to. Said she can't eat without you. I've created a monster, Natalya mumbled to herself, though a smile crept onto her face at the thought of Ms. Claudette. White-haired, with fine wrinkles that were a testimony to her longevity, Ms. Claudette was one of Natalya's favorites. No one knew where she'd come from or how she'd ended up homeless. She spoke with a southern accent that made Natalya think of Lézare Arsenault every time the older woman spoke. Hearing Ms. Claudette talk was like a trip down a wonderful memory lane, one that always resulted in a tiny bit of heartbreak for Natalya because she knew there was no way she'd ever have a future with Lézare. Natalya glanced at the time on the phone screen. She'd missed the cocktail party at Arsenault Point for certain if she went to the shelter to see Ms. Claudette, because there was no way she'd get by without spending at least an hour or two with her. Natalya sighed. She didn't know why she bothered thinking about it. It wasn't as if she wasn't going to go see Ms. Claudette. Of course she was. She'd shoot for the masquerade ball, since she'd never make it to the cocktail party on time. She made a U-turn in the parking lot, then entered the ramp to Highway 290, going west. Natalya pulled into the parking lot at the homeless shelter. It was after dinner time already, but if Ms. Claudette hadn't eaten, Natalya was certain they'd have held a plate for her. She locked her car, avoided the loose boards on the front porch, and entered the dilapidated building. Monica greeted her with a come-hither wave. She's in quite a mood. Said you told her you'd see her soon, and you were here every Friday and Saturday night, and she wasn't having dinner without you. We told her you were going out of town. She wouldn't have it. I'll talk to her. She would have to explain to Ms. Claudette she wouldn't be there tomorrow night. She would absolutely not drive back to eat dinner with her. She wanted to see Lézare again, and only the cover of a masquerade ball would allow her that. She had to go. Had to. She's in the library. It's the only place I could arrange for her to have some peace while she ate. But we can't keep breaking the rules for her. Rolling her eyes, Monica handed Natalya a plate that was warm to the touch. Good luck. Natalya didn't mind that Ms. Claudette was demanding and she had to accommodate her, but she knew it created extra work for the staff. She hadn't meant to spoil the elderly lady. She knocked on the door and pushed it open. It's about time. Ms. Claudette, who was sitting in a wing chair, turned her head away from the window. Shame on you, Natalya chastised. Her tone matched the smile on her lips. You've given the staff a rough time of it. You're supposed to be here Friday and Saturday nights. I told them there had to be something wrong if you weren't here. Miss Claudette. Natalya set the plate down and pulled the table closer to the older woman. I told you I'd be gone this weekend. No, you didn't. Oh yes, I did. And don't go pretending you don't remember. That act won't work on me. I mean, no, you can't go. A flash lit up in the depths of Ms. Claudette's eyes. Natalya would have sworn it was a blue flash, but Ms. Claudette's eyes were brown. The flash happened again. Definitely blue. Natalya didn't want to be caught staring, so she looked out the window. You need to eat, Ms. Claudette. I know what you are. Natalya froze. It felt like an Arctic gust had washed over her body. She knows. She knows I'm a rich brat. Her tigress snarled. But I'm not that person anymore. What do you mean? Claudette paused, her fork midway between the plate and her mouth, and tucked back a stray lock of hair that had escaped a wayward bun. A tigress. A shifter. Natalya gasped. Who? She couldn't think of what else to say. How could Ms. Claudette know what she was? How did she even know about shifters at all? The blue flame in the back of Ms. Claudette's eyes grew more brilliant. You're? Natalya took a chair from the table and sat next to Ms. Claudette. What are you? I'm inside Claudette. The voice was different than Ms. Claudette's. Who are you? Natalya whispered. A shiver passed over her body. My name is Alan. Where's Ms. Claudette? I'm here. This time it was Claudette's voice. So I can talk to both of you at the same time? Of course, Claudette said. Alan has been with me for most of my life. Actually, I've been with her for all of her life. I merely chose not to reveal myself to her until I was certain she could handle it. You have no idea how many commit suicide because they think they've gone crazy when we enter their body and join with them. Natalya shook her head. This is unbelievable. Oh, really? Claudette said. And having a tiger inside of you is more believable? For me it is. It's always been this way. But I've never seen. Natalya exhaled with a whoosh. I've never seen anything like this. You've never heard of an elemental? Oh. Yes. I've just never met one. I'm pretty sure I should be afraid of them. She'd heard elementals could control the weather, fire, water. She tried to remember what else she'd heard, but it had been so long ago, and nothing really stuck in her mind. I'm dying, Claudette said just like that, without any sugarcoating. Miss Claudette, we all die, sooner or later. Natalya put a comforting hand on the older woman's arm. No, she means soon, Alan interjected. This was eerie. With both of them in the same body, it was difficult to discern which one would speak until they'd actually said something. And Alan needs to move. Claudette's eyes glazed over. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too, Alan said. It's been a wonderful life with you. I wish you'd stayed with your family, though. You know I couldn't, Claudette responded. They thought I was a sorceress. They shouldn't have cared. Elle's voice was angry. It felt surreal for Natalya, watching the two conversing but using the same mouth, the same lips, though very different voices. Alan didn't have Miss Claudette's accent. It reminded Natalya of Vax's accent a bit, but different, and it was quite unlike Miss Claudette's southern drawl. Natalya found herself feeling sad, wondering if Alan would die with Miss Claudette or if something else would happen. What happens to Alan when you, she couldn't say die, go. She leaves me. Claudette clasped hands covered with skin so frail and translucent it reminded Natalya of paper. Leaves you? And goes where? The blue light shone brilliantly in Claudette's eyes. I find a new home. You mean a new person? Natalya moved her chair back. Don't be afraid. Elle's voice sounded otherworldly, as if it was coming through a hollow tube. I don't seek out mature individuals. I am eternal. I have no reason to rush. I prefer to join with bodies that are not formed yet. I'm not sure I like this conversation. Natalya's voice was shaky. I could shift and kill Alan in less time than it would take for someone to come in. But that would mean killing Ms. Claudette too. She could never do that. She'd become fond of Ms. Claudette and their gin-playing evenings and their talks. Put your tigress away, Ms. Claudette said. Natalya cocked her head. I see her in your eyes. Just as I know you saw Alan in mine. Natalya nodded. Claudette is fond of you, Alan said. And I like her to be happy. She has moments, you know. Natalya knew she'd noticed. And you help her out during those moments? I could never abandon her. I'll be with her until the end. Elle's voice grew thick as if she were choking on tears. She wants you to be there too. Why? You remind her of someone from her past. Of course, she's not really remembering this quite right. You look nothing like her. But as you do, she would also visit those less fortunate. Who do I remind her of? A distant relative of hers by marriage, long dead now. Céline Arsenault. Natalya gasped softly. This can't be a coincidence. That name means something to you? It was Elle's voice, but Miss Claudette's head tipped to the right, one silver brow raised. No. She didn't care if she lied. Natalya wasn't interested in revealing her association with the Arsenault. That would be too close to showing her feelings for Lézare. This isn't about food, is it? You didn't bring me here because Miss Claudette isn't eating. Natalya gazed into the old woman's eyes, wanting her to answer, not the being inside her, the one called Alan. Did you, Miss Claudette? I don't want to be alone. And I don't want Alan to be alone. Claudette, I told you I can take care of myself. I've been taking care of myself for ages. Eons. Natalya wanted to shake her head to clear it. It was one thing to know you were a shifter, to know supernatural beings existed. But this was mind-boggling. Now she understood how it must be for humans to encounter shifters, equally confusing. Miss Claudette. Natalya took the frail hand in hers. You're not dying anytime soon. Don't go fretting about this. Promise me you'll be there, though. Promise me. I promise. Natalya pushed the plate closer. Now eat, please. I need to get on the road. I'm going out of town, and I won't be here tomorrow night. Okay? I'll come see you as soon as I'm back in town. Natalya was confused. How could an Arsenault relative be here? Lézare couldn't possibly know. He wouldn't let his relatives live in a homeless shelter while he lived in opulence. He wasn't that type of man. She bit back her urge to ask Ms. Claudette questions. Mind your own business, she chastised herself. I can't. She wanted to know how one of Lézare's relatives, even by marriage, could be living in a homeless shelter. Claudette took dainty bites, slowly, as if she was savoring both the meal and the moments. The blue flash in her eyes was gone. Natalya sat with her while she stretched one dinner plate into a 2-hour visit. Finally, Natalya walked her to her cot in the community room, leaned in, and gave her a kiss on her lined cheek. She was going to get Ms. Claudette better accommodations, she decided. She'd put her in a nursing home where she could have a private room and live out the rest of her days with dignity. As soon as I return from Louisiana. Don't forget your promise, Miss Claudette whispered as she closed her eyes. I'll be there. I will. She didn't want to think of Miss Claudette dying.
Chapter 6. What's up? Vax stared at Lézare's face. Lézare tried to hide his emotions. He hadn't expected his cousin to walk in on him before he could compose himself prior to returning to the party. Not much. That doesn't look like not much. Vax pointed to Lézare's hand on the phone. The phone was cracked. Accident. Lézare loosened his grip on the cordless and put it back on its base. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. Just don't tell me it's nothing. Lézare nodded, then turned toward the French windows overlooking the garden, lit up now with hanging lanterns and lights hidden behind the topiaries and the maze. The way the house was placed, even the first floor where they were standing now, overlooked the gardens and the maze it contained. A maze composed of careful architecture and manicured hedges, all 10 feet tall. It had taken him a long time to master. Should he tell Vax that Natalya was missing? Would Vax care? He knew Natalya had caused a lot of trouble for Vax, and he doubted Vax would understand his feelings for her, even if Natalya didn't feel the same way. Truthfully, Lézare had hoped he'd find someone else at the masquerade, someone who would reciprocate his feelings. Someone who'd fill some of his solitude. Someone who'd help him forget Natalya. He doubted he'd find the right one. Deep inside, his tiger snarled at Lézare. His tiger knew their fated mate. Lézare tuned the tiger out the same way he used to tune his sisters out when they were younger, and would bicker. Silent, Vax watched Lézare, not imposing on his thoughts or reflections but also not leaving the room. "It's someone," Lézare began, then he thought of what he'd been about to say. It sounded so dumb. "There's someone who's disappeared, and that was a call to help." "Not just any someone, judging from the look on your face," Vax said. "True. And you can't go because you're here, doing this." "That sums it up. This is my duty. This person who's missing. You think they're in trouble?" "Maybe." Her father certainly seemed to think so. "My contact thinks there could be a problem, that it's out of character. Could Alexa handle this place? If I'm here, and offer support of any kind that she might need? It's unheard of, my not being here. Not being a part of this. The masquerade ball's tomorrow night. In 24 hours. Lézare nodded. "Then take 24 hours to go find whoever it is." It was as if Vax wanted to press, but at the same time, didn't want to infringe on Lézare's privacy. "I don't know, cousin." "I do. It's final." Vax strode to the door of the study, opened it, and waved his hand. Alexa came in, frowning. She was almost as tall as Lézare with those heels on, looking every bit as authoritative as Lézare would need her to be. "What happened?" She glanced from Lézare to Vax, then back again. "Can you handle this if I leave for a few hours?" She chewed on her lip. "Sure, but can't you tell me what's wrong?" "Some other time. I'm not up to talking about it right now. I'll be back in time for the ball, I promise. Have I ever let you down?" "No, but I'll worry about you and whatever is making you worry the whole time." Lézare kissed her forehead, kept his lips pressed against her cool flesh. "You're the best sister a brother could ask for. I'll tell you when I get it figured out." Vax put a hand on Lézare's shoulder. "The Nielsen's just arrived. I asked them if they could let us know what's going on with the underground fighting ring." Lézare was torn. Would a few moments matter one way or another? "Tell them to wait until brunch on Sunday morning. It's not as though anyone's going to leave the party tonight or the ball tomorrow to go look into this," Alexa said. "True." Lézare gave his sister an appreciative glance. "Indeed," Vax agreed. "Go take care of this thing you have to handle. We'll be here taking care of this. We'll try not to miss you much." Alexa kissed Lézare on the cheek, then put her hand on Vax's arm and let him escort her out of the room. Filled with sadness, Lézare watched them go. One day, another man would be escorting his sister, permanently, if she ever found someone who could handle her. "Good luck," Lézare whispered to that unknown man, already feeling pity for someone he hadn't even met and couldn't put a face to. The poor guy would need it. Alexa's strong will could be a handful. Then he thought of another strong-willed woman, one with lush curves and a fearsome temper. One who was missing. The last time he'd seen her, she'd stomped her foot and hurled curses at him. And damned if that hadn't given him a hard-on. "I'm so fucked up. We're just plain fucked."
Chapter 7. On the day of the ball, Natalya read the road sign ahead. "Welcome to Louisiana." She shook her head and caught a glimpse of her eyes in the rearview mirror. There were deep dark circles beneath both of them. She looked haggard. "Why am I driving to Louisiana? Surely, I don't intend to go to the ball. I'm not even welcome there, I'm sure of that." The invitation did have her name and her father's name on it, but she was certain she'd been included as a courtesy, not because they'd meant for her to be invited. A little farther, and she'd be in New Orleans. Then she'd have to make a decision. Was she going to Arsenault Point? "I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to fool those good people." Her tigress snarled in disagreement. "I'm not saying I don't want to go. I simply don't want to be a liar or a fake." But God, she wanted to see his face again. To see those dark eyes, full lips, and that close-cut curly hair that she could tell wanted to go wild. His tan skin, his high cheekbones. She hadn't been able to get him out of her mind. He raced through her thoughts day and night. How would he react if he saw her again? He'd probably treat her like the child he considered her to be. The last time they butted heads, he'd threatened to put her over his knee and spank her ass. He'd actually said, "Spank your derriere." But why did the memory make an ache return to her core? Why did it make her heart beat faster, her pulse race? Why did this sexy man who spoke French with a smooth southern accent get so deeply under her skin? Lézare pulled back in the driveway at Arsenault Point. The last 24 hours had been a bust. He'd found nothing, had no success whatsoever. He'd stopped in Houston first, at the apartment she'd holed up in when she'd faked her kidnapping all those months ago. No luck. Then he had driven to Austin, and found nothing there either. How does a woman disappear like that? He scratched the thicker stubble that had come in over the last 24 hours. Was this a stunt? Was it more of her temperamental pouting? Had her father not bought her the latest Porsche or Lexus? He didn't want to think something could really be wrong. He'd rather think she was having a tantrum. He had 30 minutes to get dressed and get to the front of the house to greet the guests for the ball. After pulling behind the house, he threw the keys to one of the valet crew, then made for the back door, hoping to slip in unnoticed and get a shower, certain he smelled as worn out as he felt. No sooner had he opened the door than one of the junior housekeepers turned away from the stove and gave him a once-over. He could tell how haggard he must appear from her expression. "Mr. Arsenault, where you been? You look like you've been chasing death." "More like death chased me. I was helping a friend. I'd kill for a coffee right now." "I'll have one sent to your room." "Are you getting ready for your party?" Mayleen's flustered. These contracted people. She shook her head, hands on her hips. And Miss Alexa's going crazy, trying to manage what apparently is a long to-do list. Plus, she's got Ms. Evie to worry about. Shit. That's right. I'll be quick. I need to take a shower, then I'll join her. How about the crew? Are they in place? Do they seem to have it together? Oh yes. Most of them are the same from last year. They're all in uniform. All with their masks on, ready to serve and entertain. Thanks, Annabelle. He slipped by her and ran for his wing of the house. He took the steps two at a time and sprinted the last bit of the hallway, skidding to a stop in front of his door. Lézare. Alexa's voice. "I'll be there in 5, I swear." He turned to face his little sister, feeling guilty about having left her to handle all this, though he'd thought he had it pretty well lined up with the staffing agency and the catering. "Evie's making me crazy." Alexa had dark circles under her eyes that matched his own. "Thank God we're wearing masks tonight." "I'll talk to her." "There's no talking to her. She's locked herself up in her room. She's refusing to come out. She said as long as Mason Martinez is under the same roof, she's not going to the ball. That takes care of that problem. I see nothing that needs dealing with then." He grabbed the door handle and turned it. Alexa sighed. "And Valencia isn't here yet." "What the fuck?" he murmured under his breath. "Did she call?" "Yes. Said she got tied up and won't be here until somewhere around 6 tomorrow morning." "She's okay." Sounded like it. "Attendance at the masquerade ball isn't compulsory." "That's not what you told me 6 years ago, when I said I didn't want to come home from college." "I'm getting more lenient in my old age." He gave her a charming smile, hoping to buy him a pass. He hadn't been able to manage all of his sisters when they were younger. He'd needed someone to step in line, and he'd used any means he could with Alexa. He had to play parent to his sisters, but he couldn't handle 3 of them at once. He didn't feel guilty for putting pressure on Alexa. She shook her head at him and waved him off. "Hurry up. I want to have some fun tonight. Catch me up on what I missed when I'm done. Meet you downstairs in 5. Chapter 8. It was Saturday afternoon. Plenty of time for Natalya to still make it to the ball. She pulled into the driveway of magnificent stately Arsenault Point, where Spanish moss adorned every other live oak tree, beautiful but deadly, and thought of the last time she'd been here, months and months ago, when she'd exchanged cross words with the man she couldn't forget now. Natalya took a deep breath and held it in, examining the scents. The area was teeming with shifters. She could scent them. She needed to find a place to hide. Somewhere to put her mask on. She had no intention of being discovered. She'd be booted out like the trespasser she was. Minutes later, she took the car to the end of the driveway, drove around the fountain, and waved the valet away. There was no way she was parking this close to the house. Someone would see her before she was hidden behind her mask. She'd passed a dirt road turnoff halfway down the driveway. Natalya turned the car around and headed toward it, and nosed the car into the hidden lane, pine trees rising on each side like sentinels. The road ended just shy of a lone cabin. Natalya killed the engine and listened for any sounds of life, but heard nothing. The desolate cabin was vacant of both humans and shifters. After she'd grabbed her bag, the dress she'd picked up, her high heels, and the mask she couldn't put in a bag for fear of crushing it, she made her way down a narrow path to the cabin's front door, cobwebbed and covered with untouched pollen and dust. Praying the door wasn't locked, she turned the handle. With a squeaky protest and a groan, the hinges gave way. Success. A bead of sweat tickled her temple. It wasn't that warm outside. Nerves were making her perspire. She rubbed her palms on her thighs. She was thankful she'd taken a double dose of Hunter's block, particularly if she was going to be perspiring like this. The cabin wasn't lit, but that didn't matter. Her shifter senses would give her the vision she needed. The one thing she really wanted. She opened what she hoped was the restroom door. Eureka! A mirror in the restroom. Not full length, but at least she'd be able to see what she was doing when she tried to fix her blonde mop. 30 minutes later, she looked down at the black dress, holding it away from the floor so it wouldn't be trimmed with dust, then took a last glance at the mirror. Her black and gold mask covered 3/4 of her face. Black feathers rose from one side, curling over gracefully. The mask and the shoes were the only things she'd bought new. The dress was one she'd had from years ago, when she'd attended some event and had then stuffed it into the back of her closet where it had been since then, forgotten and unused. She let herself out of the cabin and threw her bag onto the front seat, on top of the creased and tear-stained invitation, and closed the car door quietly. She picked her way among the pine needles, leaves, and roots that had eased their way above ground. Her heels sank into a soft patch. She pulled it out of the dirt and wiped it off with a handful of leaves. The sun had fallen, the forest was under a blanket of darkness. She could hear the sounds of revelry and followed them. She breathed a sigh of relief when she found the driveway. At least walking would be easier this way. Making better time on paved road, she spotted the oversized marble staircase at the front of the mansion within moments. Seconds later, she'd just climbed to the top of the stairs and paused to get her bearings. Her tigress growled. Fine. Fine. I'm looking for him. I admit it. Miss? A masked man with a clipboard approached. Your invitation, please? Natalya froze. Now what? She left the invitation in the car, but she'd be discovered if she'd given him the invitation anyway. Lézare would know she was here. His sisters would. Vax would, everyone would. And they'd shame her. All I want is to see him. I don't mean anyone any harm. I won't create any problems. Her tigress snarled. Miss, the man said again. I didn't bring it. Was I supposed to? Yes, but I can look you up by name. Oh shit. No, that won't do. Not at all. She couldn't give him her name. She racked her brain to come up with a name. The only ones she could come up with were Arsino and Tiero names, and there was no way she could use either of those. She'd be caught in a heartbeat. Delaney Devereaux. What the hell? She surely wasn't good at improvisation. Ms. Devereaux. He used his pen as a marker and checked each name in the letter D column. Natalya tapped her foot, as if she was in a hurry and impatient to get inside. He ran through the whole column again. I'm sorry, Ms. Devereaux. I don't see your name. Then perhaps you should go check with Lézare Arsenault. He personally sent me an invitation. Beneath the man's mask, his lips drew into a tight line, then curved into a forced smile. He looked around. I'm not sure I should leave my post. It's your decision. I don't care if you piss Lézare off, and he never uses your company again. I'll be right back. He spun around and slipped through the front door. Natalya waited until he was out of sight, then picked up her skirts and darted as fast as her heels could carry her toward a set of French doors on the other side of the veranda. She shimmied past a couple embracing one another, and leaned against the wall. Phew! She was inside. The room was semi-dark, lit only with candles. It didn't take any time to adjust, with her shifter vision. The glow from the candles bathed the shifters in a golden glow. A massive chandelier hung from the center of the chamber, capturing and reflecting light from the candles, almost creating an old-school disco ball. Natalya walked a few paces toward the walls lined with long windows, alternating with French doors that opened to the back, presenting an extravagant maze with 10-foot-tall hedges, and a fountain surrounded by shifters sitting on the edge, moving in and out of the shadows as they made their way to and from the main house, stealing kisses on occasion. To the side was a courtyard with a gazebo in the center, lit up with tiny lights. She turned toward the center of the room, where an orchestra played in the far corner, entertaining the opulently dressed guests. A tingle rushed through her, strumming her nerve endings. Lézare. She knew it was he who caused it. He'd done the very same thing to her the last time she'd seen him. That wasn't the day he'd told her with a gleam in his eyes that he'd spank her derriere. No, she'd seen him one other time, when she was in Dallas. She'd followed the Tiero sisters and Alexa when they'd gone on a shopping spree, and then they'd met up with their brother Lézare. She'd watched him from across the street, rememorizing every muscle on his hard body, the tilt of his head when he laughed, the curve of his full lips when he smiled, the way his eyes studied the room, always on guard. She'd even noticed the way he kept glancing around, his gaze sticking in her general direction as though he'd sensed something or someone was there. Oh yes. That man was burned into her memory, as surely as if she'd been marked with a cattle brand. In the spacious Arsenault ballroom, she stayed half-tucked behind a curtain, surveying the room. The space was the size of a gym, shifters mingling with each other, men in tuxedos in a variety of colors, the ladies resplendent in all hues of the color palette. Masks covered their faces. Natalya was happy she could hide behind her mask. Without it, the Arsenault sisters would probably rip her hair out. Or sever my jugular. Especially Alexa. She clearly didn't take a liking to me. She wouldn't have been surprised if the Tiero sisters did the same. Once they'd figured out her fake kidnapping, they'd spurned her the one and only time she'd seen them again, when she'd visited Dallas. Natalya had wanted to tell them she was sorry. She'd followed them, hoping to get a moment with them. But the way Alexa, the Tiero sisters and Callie had all laughed and carried on had made her turn chicken. Then, when they'd seen her and looked right past her as if she wasn't even alive. How could she have talked to them then? It's hard to do that when someone stares right past you, as if you're not even there. She surveyed the men, studying each one to see if Lézare behind the mask, but she saw no sign of him. He was here though. He had to be. She felt the same tingling sensation any time he was within a few yards of her. She glanced around, her eyes taking in the room, traveling from man to man. Where is he?
Chapter 9. Itchy. Irritating. Lézare fiddled with the mask he'd donned for the masquerade ball. He wasn't fond of wearing them, never had been. They were his least favorite part of the ball. He did enjoy the ladies wearing masks though, and dresses that hugged their curves. He wove his way among the guests. His tiger growled. Lézare froze. A sensation flowed through his body, coursing over his flesh like a feathery caress, then making his nerve endings feel as though they were on fire, dipped into hot candle wax during the most intimate of moments. He fought the shiver, threatening his body. Someone here was getting his tiger's attention, and by default, seizing control of Lézare's body, making him react in a way that pushed him toward the cliff, near the tempting fires of the abyss of lust. He allowed his tiger's senses to take over, more accurate as a radar than his human senses. The tiger focused, scanning the room, locating the source in a dark corner. Lézare turned, ready to find the cause of the energy searing his center. A hand on his shoulder stopped him. Lézare faced the one obstructing him from his mission. Alexa! He glanced away from his sister, toward the French doors in the corner. A figure, curvy and voluptuous in black with a touch of gold, slipped toward the depths of the ballroom, her back to him. He took note of the sway of her hips and the roundness of her ass with every step she took, until he could see no more, completely barred from that glorious view by other guests. Alexa tapped him on the shoulder. I thought we were going to talk. Yes. He chanced to look for the creature in black and gold. No sign of the woman. He wiped the scowl from his face before he focused on his sister once more. Yes. Sorry. He peered over her shoulder, scanning the crowd for the woman. Are you having fun? Alexa didn't answer him. Lézare pinned her with his gaze. Now she was the distracted one. Alexa. She glanced his way. Yes. Sorry. Her words mimicked his, but she seemed suddenly distracted. Who is that? She nodded toward the center of the room with a slight tip of her head. He turned toward the crowd. Who? Is someone being a problem? Do I need to get them out of here? No. Her answer was sharp. Sorry. No. The tall guy. The hot one. He scanned the group. Who the hell was she talking about? She yanked on his sleeve impatiently. The one with short hair. That's Reese. Lézare took stock of the expression on her face. Alexa. Seriously? What? Her voice was too high, too innocent. Lézare shook his head, holding back a smile. Nothing. Reese Nielsen. Yeah. Was this why his sister had brought him away from the vixen in black and gold? Would she know who the woman was? He didn't want to give away that he was interested in someone. He typically played it much closer to the vest, even with his nearest and dearest sister. So, I think I'm going to sink into some fun. You never said why you had to leave. Of course I didn't, because you can't stand Natalya, and if you knew I'd left you here with all this responsibility so I could try to help find her, you'd be pissed. Nothing worth talking about during the party. Just a business associate who needed help with something. With what? He lost something. She gave him a sideways glance. He needed to get her off the topic. How was today? Any drama? No. Not really. Well, sort of. Callie thought she had a contraction. Lézare's eyes flew toward Vax's mate. She's fine, Alexa reassured him. She thinks maybe it was something she ate. Verd. Shit. It's good Doc and May are here. Tell me about it. You weren't here, and I was juggling the temporary help, trying to keep them out of Maylene's way. She's flustered. She said next year she's taking her vacation during this week. Lézare laughed. Maylene threatened the same thing every year. Anything else? He noticed her eyes hadn't strayed far from Reese Nielsen for more than a few seconds. Not at the moment. Why don't you approach him? What? She turned her gaze his way, her eyes piercing his, as if she was trying to determine whether he was serious or picking on her. No. It's okay, Alexandria. Lézare knew the things she wouldn't say. Alexa didn't trust men. She might look and admire, but she kept them at arm's length. She nodded, a stiff smile on her lips. Would she ever be comfortable enough to address that matter? Or would she forever be without a mate? Like me. Lézare didn't want to be without a mate. Hell no. He was more than ready, and the one he wanted had never left his mind. His tiger roared. Fine. Okay. True. She never left my mind until I saw that woman tonight. How could he be attracted to a woman he hadn't talked to? He hadn't even seen her face. All he'd seen was a body that was say magnifique. I think I'll go check on things. He planted a quick kiss on his sister's cheek. See you soon. Then he darted away, slipping through the throngs of revelers, making a direct line toward the corner the black and gold-clad beauty had been in. Once there, Lézare took a deep breath, hoping he'd find some scent, some trace of her. He found nothing. He followed the same direction she'd taken, hoping he would have more luck. Why am I in such a hurry? It's not like I don't have 12 hours until brunch. Nothing would end until brunch. That was when the attendees would all disband and go home. Surely he'd find her before then. Unless another shifter sets his mind to having her. His pulse sped up, his strides lengthened. He wasn't having that.
Chapter 10. Natalya knew Lézare was there before she saw him, before her shifter hearing picked up the timbre of his voice. She knew because the sensation that struck her whenever he was around happened again, just like it always did. Voltage surged throughout her body, lighting her nerve endings on fire, leaving her breathless and with a racing pulse. She glanced around the mostly filled to capacity ballroom. So many men, all of them in suits and masks. So many women in long dresses, also masked. Could she find him in here? Would she be able to? It seemed as if there was a divining rod in play, for her gaze was pulled toward him like magic. There he was, off to the right, talking to a masked redhead. She felt his scrutiny. Like a predator's, it traveled through the room, then settled on Natalya, passed over her, hesitated, and returned to her. Even in the dark room, even with dozens of people milling about, and the music playing loudly, she could still feel the warmth of his scrutiny. His eyes strayed back to her repeatedly, while he conversed with the red-headed woman. Natalya knew that red hair, his sister Alexa. Just one of the Arsino who hated her. Why am I here? It's not like he'll want me. It's not like his family will ever like me. A sob at the futility of being here seized in her throat. She needed to get out before she became emotional, and a room full of shifters picked up on it and began to search for the source. Natalya bolted away from the crowd, following the wall, going as far from the front door as she could, far away from the doorman who would recognize and remember her. And kick me out. Which wasn't something she was ready to have happen, even though she didn't feel as though she belonged and was certain that if she was recognized, she'd be sent packing. I'll be lucky if that's all Alexa does to me. She expected Alexa to tar and feather her, especially since she was well aware how much trouble she'd caused for Lézare. Natalya stuck to the walls, going around the perimeter of the room, avoiding the dance floor and the throngs of people there, until finally she found a set of double doors and slipped out. She was on a balcony, overlooking a large maze in front of her, a gazebo off to one side, and a magnificent lighted fountain on the other side of the maze. The maze was occupied with shifters seeking their way through the tall passages. The gazebo was empty. That was her destination. A bit of privacy where she could reclaim her composure, and maybe even talk some sense into herself. Natalya wove a path among a collection of couples, all shifters, all very involved with each other, holding hands and kissing, laughing gently. Their sounds were sensuous and low, gentle lullabies that merged with the sounds of crickets and distant bullfrogs. Those should be comforting sounds. They should make her happy to be amongst such merriment, amongst shifters finding their enjoyment and even their mates at the event. She couldn't find enjoyment. She was tormented by her thoughts. All she could think of was that Lézare would find a woman who would make him laugh a husky laugh, touch him with lust, kiss him with passion, and who knew what else. And that whoever he found would not be her. I'm such a fool. So leave then, fool, she rebuked herself. But like a moth drawn to a flame, she couldn't. She wanted to see him again, later, when she'd regained self-control and her emotions wouldn't get the best of her. She wanted to memorize the way he looked when he laughed, the tilt of his head, the curve of his smile, his broad shoulders and wide chest. That short hair and beautifully hued skin of his. She sighed. "Tell me his name and I'll make him pay," said a voice close to her ear. She half jumped and half flinched. Then she set her hand on her chest. The words had been low, sensual, husky, exactly what she'd wanted, and they'd been delivered by the very man she wanted. Lézare. Would he recognize her voice if she spoke? Everything he'd heard her say had been screamed and yelled several months ago. She'd never stopped to talk to him, not really talk, there'd only been yelling, snapping, and even whining. Lézare had found her, the mystery woman in black trimmed with gold. She was in the gazebo, facing away from him. He could tell from her body language she was unhappy. Then she sighed. He'd heard her sigh from more than a dozen paces away, and was grateful for his shifter hearing. With tiger-quick speed he was upon her unnoticed. He leaned in, inhaling her womanly essence but not picking up any sign of her shifter scent. Of course she was a shifter. Who or what else would dare come to a shifter ball? "Tell me his name and I'll make him pay." He spoke the words close to her ear. She jumped and jerked away, still not facing him. "I apologize. I didn't mean to scare you." He studied the voluptuous body, sheathed in the black dress. It showcased her curves, emphasizing a full bust and rounded hips which tapered into her waist. Something about her figure reminded him. "No, it can't be." She cleared her throat, then faced him. Dark green eyes were framed by blonde eyelashes. Those eyes. He glanced at her lips. Her teeth had captured the bottom one, worrying it. "Keep that up and you'll make it bleed." He raised a thumb to her mouth and freed her lip from its captivity. He didn't move his thumb, instead leaving it resting on the slightly swollen pink flesh while his fingers curled under her chin. He felt her pulse as surely as he felt his own throbbing in his body. Her heartbeat began a race, matching his own. The music coming from the house, the sounds of merriment from the balcony, the sounds of the Louisiana woods just beyond their manicured lawn, all of it faded away. It was as if he was being sucked into a whirlpool, except she was there with him and they were standing still. This sensation, he knew he'd experienced it before. His tiger roared in his head. The scent wasn't there. She was wearing block. But she'd received the invitation. And she'd come. His tiger chuffed with pleasure. Natalya had come. He'd hoped what he felt when he'd had seen her last wasn't one-sided. But why was she hiding her identity? Why the block? Why not come through the front door and announce herself? It doesn't matter. She's here. That's all that matters. Lézare's thumb rested on her lip. How she wanted to take it in her mouth, to taste it, to feel its texture against her tongue. She closed her eyes, sure when she opened them he'd be gone. "A dance?" His words were a low whisper, so low only her shifter hearing could pick them up. She swallowed. This was the moment. She hoped her voice wouldn't crack like a teenager's or worse, sound like a toad's. "Here." She managed to let the word out with a breath. "I can think of a more magical place, Cher." His pronunciation, his accent, the husky note in his voice, all of these seduced her. It was magical. The moon in the distance, bathing the greenery around them with a silvery glow. The music merging with the sounds of the night. The smell of jasmine merging with his earthy, musky scent. "I'll remember this night forever, long after he's only a distant memory." Sadness pierced her heart at the thought that this would be all they'd share. She nodded, unable to speak, for fear the unhappiness was so pervasive it would escape from between her lips. He stepped closer, his broad shoulders and wide chest blocking her view of anything but him. Large hands on her hips pulled her close to his body, so close they were almost touching, so close she could feel the heat from his flesh through her clothing. She looped her hands behind his neck. "You're not from around here," he said, his voice hushed and intimate. No. How much could she tell him? She didn't want to say anything. She knew how he'd react the moment she said she was Natalya Solis. He'd jerk back and what? He'd probably feel scorn and disgust. She was better off saying nothing more. Luckily, he didn't press the issue. They danced, song after song, not even pausing between songs, not really even noticing the music had stopped only to start again. Natalya's tigress chuffed a low, soothing sound in her head, while her pulse became one with Lézare's. Neither said a word. Neither needed to say anything that would ruin the moment. She couldn't say when it happened, but she closed her eyes and laid her cheek on his chest, feeling the muscles swell at the contact, hearing his heart beat deep within. She would have traded anything, any eternity, to have these moments continue. Sensing a change, a ripple in their connection, she opened her eyes. Like a predator, he studied her face, even with the mask in place. His gaze bored into hers. Lézare's head lowered, and her lips parted as if controlled by some other force, as if she was watching from far above. His tongue slipped into her mouth, sending coils of sensations coursing throughout her body as it danced with hers, taking her captive, claiming her completely until she was breathless. When he finally pulled back, just a shade, a gold flash appeared in the depths of his eyes. His tiger. In Natalya's head, her tigress roared a response so loud she was certain Lézare's tiger would hear it. The energy between their tigers spun Natalya into a whirlwind of vibrations, leaving her trembling. "You feel it." His voice was husky, a low growl. She never had a chance to respond, to acknowledge what he'd said. "Lézare." A voice she didn't know interrupted them, breaking the spell, searing it closed. "Sacre bleu," Lézare hissed. "For the love of all that is holy, this had better be important." He raised his head from hers and looked off into the distance. "Callie. She's in labor."
Chapter 11. Lézare looked at his sister on the balcony, then back at the curvy beauty in his arms. "Damn the luck." "Wait here," he told Natalya. She opened her mouth as if to say something. He put his fingers over her lips. "No. Just wait. I promise I won't be long. Let me get her set up with a room, and get Doc in there with her. I'm surely not going to stay in the room while she gives birth." That was the last thing he wanted to be a witness to, his cousin's mate giving birth. Pass on that. "Wait." He studied her eyes, searching for any sign she wasn't willing. "Agreed." She nodded. He made short work of the distance across the gardens, then rushed up the staircase to Alexa. She was studying the gazebo and the woman he'd just been kissing. "Who is that?" "A guest." He glanced back at Natalya's hourglass figure, silhouetted in the black and gold dress. "Where's Callie?" "I set her up in a guest bedroom and sent some of the men to find Doc." Exactly what he would have done. Was he really even needed? With a last regretful glance at Natalya, he followed Alexa inside. Masks would make finding Doc more difficult, but it shouldn't be hard. May was in a fire-red backless dress, and Doc would be within arm's reach, of this Lézare was certain. The bear shifter was loath to leave his mate's side, unwilling to witness other shifters flirting with her. Lézare didn't blame him. He felt the same way about Natalya. Then a thought occurred to him: any shifter could approach her. Maybe he should assign someone to keep an eye on her, perhaps serve as a repellent to any shifter males who might be interested in her. "Be right there," he said to Alexa, then veered toward his security team. With a nod, Theo acknowledged Lézare's approach and met him halfway. "There's a woman in the gazebo. Blonde in a black dress with gold trim." He knew he didn't have to spell it out for Theo. They were often on the same train of thought. "Understood." Theo made an about face, and with a speed that defied the lion shifter's size, was out of sight. "Lézare." Vax forked shaky fingers through his hair. "You heard?" "Yes. I'm going to find Doc. Nothing to worry about, cousin. Humans have a harder time of giving birth to shifter babies, you know." Vax's tone was overwrought. "If there was cause for concern with Callie, Doc would have already told you something." "He hasn't, right?" "Right, but..." "Doc's on his way," Alexa interrupted as they reached the door to the room Callie was in. Gavin stood outside. "Layla, Lila, and Vela are in there with her. It's been quiet." Vax put his head against the wall. "This is the first time in my life I've felt powerless. If something happens to her..." "Nothing will." Gavin put an arm around Vax. Go be with her. I'll wait here. Thanks. Vax put his own arm around Gavin's shoulder and brought his forehead to rest against his best friend's. Lézare knew they'd been friends since childhood, that they'd been there for one another through the roughest of times. He could relate. It was like his friendship with Theo. Doc and May appeared within seconds. When May ripped her feathered mask off, she was beaming from ear to ear. It's been so long since I've attended a shifter's birth, and even though it's not in my valley, I can't help but feel we're adding to my own family. She clapped her hands together, and a deep blue gleam flashed in her eyes. In the window, a flash of lightning crossed the sky, created by her elemental. Doc's mask was already off. Does this room have a bathroom attached? I'll need to wash up. I need towels and some hot water. Lézare, have someone bring my bag from my cabin, would you? Lézare nodded to one of the men, who had followed him up the stairs. At the same time, his phone vibrated in his pocket. When he pulled it out, he saw a text from Theo. Theo, she's leaving the gazebo. He texted back. Follow her. Natalya had watched Lézare leave almost an hour ago. She wanted to stay, but he'd been gone so long that a part of her wondered if he hadn't already figured out who she was and had decided to never return. She fought the wave of depression, threatening to overtake her. I'm such a fool. She took her phone from her sequin clutch. It was after midnight. Surely he wasn't returning. That was when she noticed the text. Monica again. Claudette is being given last rites. She's asking for you. Tears sprang into Natalya's eyes. The text was from an hour ago. It would take her a good 7 or 8 hours to make it back to the shelter. Natalya glanced at the house, where the sounds of merriment were still going strong. There were people on the balcony, some by themselves, some in couples. But not a single one of them was Lézare. He's not coming back. She chastised herself for being foolish enough to think he was. Claudette needed her. She texted a reply. Tell Miss Claudette I'm on the way. Chapter 12. Lézare paced up and down the hallway outside the room Callie was in. His phone vibrated in his pocket, signaling an incoming text. He glanced at it. Theo, she's on Interstate 10. He texted back. Stay with her until I get back to you. Was she going home? Returning to Austin? Surely not. He shook his head and glanced at the door. Callie's low moans and the sound of Doc telling her to push were coming from behind the heavy wood. Downstairs, the sounds of the ball continued, laughter, music, and the sounds of glass tinkling and flirty voices. And Natalya was gone. Damn this. Damn. 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 Then he heard another sound. A baby's first cry. Oh boy. That little shifter sure sounds angry. Lézare wondered if he should go in and check. Gavin looked at Lézare and smiled. He smiled back as the door flew open and May motioned them in. In a corner of the room, a sweaty, red-faced Callie was holding a bundle wrapped in a sheet. Vax stood next to her, an expression of wonder on his face. Vela and Lila had tears streaming down their faces, even though they were smiling and laughing. It's a boy. Vax's tone was reverent. Of course it is, Callie said. Isn't that what you said all along? Yeah, well, I had no way of knowing. And truthfully, I didn't really care. Now you need to pick a name, Lila said, her hand on her own stomach. We have one picked. Callie looked up at Vax. Vax cleared his throat. Elias. Gavin snapped to attention. After my brother. His voice was choked. Vax nodded. Elias Raphael, after your brother and mine. We'll call him Eli. Next to Gavin, Layla released a sigh and held her mate's hand. Congratulations. Lézare hugged Vax. A part of him felt a twinge of melancholy. He wished. Ah, that was dangerous ground. The wishing thing. He shoved the thoughts away. Callie pushed herself up to a more comfortable position. I hate that we interrupted the party. Oh, you didn't interrupt it at all, Alexa assured her. It's still going on just as it was before. I should get back. She looked at Lézare. We should. About that. All the eyes in the room turned to him. I need to go. Not again, Alexa huffed. Valencia won't make it until tomorrow. I don't know where Evie is, and now you want to leave. Oh, come on. It's nothing you can handle. Or will it keep you from spending time with a certain wolf? Lézare smiled when her mouth dropped open. Oh, do tell. Vela said. Yes, do. Who? Lila echoed. With that, Lézare slipped out of the room. He gave Vax a final glance as he crossed the threshold. Vax nodded. He understood, even if he didn't know what was happening. Lézare pressed Theo's name on his phone screen and put the phone on speaker. Theo answered. How's she doing? Where are you at? She's going well over 100. She'd better watch out. We're past the speed traps, but you never know. Theo told him where he was. Where are you? Less than an hour behind you. I'll catch up. Any idea why she's fleeing from the hounds of hell? None. But I aim to find out. He punched the gas pedal with even more vigor. Lézare was pushing the speedometer well past the range of getting himself pulled over, and then some, but he didn't give a damn. He'd pay any and all tickets, as long as he could reach Natalya, before she could sequester herself away in her father's home, or wherever she intended to hide from him. Shit. Her father. He needed to call her father, and let him know his daughter wasn't in any danger. He glanced at his watch. No. It was probably too late. And if that was my daughter, would I be sleeping now? Or would I be up all night, worrying? He knew what he had to do. Lézare dialed her father's number. Arsenault. Any word? She's fine. One of my men has his eye on her. I'm going to her right now. She's not far outside Austin. The old shifter exhaled a sigh of relief. Thank you again. I owe you. You never know what I may want as payment. No need to dwell on that right now. I'll touch base with you later. I know she'll be in good hands. Lézare ended the call with a quick tap on the screen. Good hands. Maybe not. But my hands, hopefully.
Chapter 13. Please let her be alive. Please. 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 Natalya sent silent prayers to any entity which might listen, and grant her prayer that Ms. Claudette hadn't died. She pulled into the shelter's parking lot, scrambled out and locked her car. She was still in her party dress. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Well, not exactly nothing. Lézare mattered. But this was oh so very different. Monica opened the door for her. Is she? Natalya couldn't bring herself to say the words. She's alive. And awake. It's the weirdest thing. What? Natalya thought she was braced for anything and everything when it came to Ms. Claudette, after the shocks she'd already had. She woke up 5 minutes ago and the first thing she said was, Natalya is on her way. Then she asked for a Manhattan. Did Alan know somehow Natalya was nearby? Monica was walking too slowly for Natalya, so she stepped around her and rushed toward the main sleeping area. No. Not there, Monica said. We didn't want her to be in the community sleeping area. Not if she? Not while she? Where is she? In the infirmary. Natalya made a sharp left and headed down the long corridor. When she reached the infirmary, she opened the door slowly without knocking. Ms. Claudette lay propped up on a bed, her eyes closed. As soon as Natalya shut the door behind her, Ms. Claudette's eyes flew open. I knew you'd come. I told Alan you would. What took you so long? Her voice was a croaking whisper. Ms. Claudette. Natalya took her hand. I told you I'd be out of town. I needed you. Her voice had a little girl quality to it. She's regressing, Alan said, appearing as a flash of blue in Claudette's brown eyes. Outside, a clap of thunder made the windows vibrate. Is she? They told me. She doesn't have long to live. Natalya hated saying the words, even though Ms. Claudette's mind didn't seem to be present. That was my doing. Why? Natalya stared at the blue gleam, trying to separate her mind from the notion there were two souls in one body. I don't know when she will go. She cannot die here. I cannot be here when she passes. I need another. Oh my God. You want me to help you find a new host? Please don't say it like that. It's not that simple. Elle's voice was sad. The blue flash vanished from the liquid brown pools. You have to help her. It was Ms. Claudette's voice. Lézare pulled up next to Theo's car, then jumped out in one smooth motion, eager to find Natalya. What the hell is this? A homeless shelter? That's where she went in. The door right there. Theo pointed to a side door. What the hell is she doing here? Theo shrugged. No clue. But she hasn't come out. I scouted the building. There's only one other exit. He indicated another door, clearly within view. She hasn't come out. I assure you of that, Lézare. Who was Natalya, really? He thought of the screaming, petulant shrew he'd first met, and realized he'd been attracted to her even when she was at her worst. He thought of the woman he'd been with a few hours ago. He'd sensed something different in her then. He remembered her father's words, she hasn't been the same since she returned from your place. She's been concentrating on her studies. No parties. Nothing. She's a different woman. Okay, fine, he was willing to concede she was a different woman now. But a homeless shelter? I'll take it from here, he told Theo. Go on home. You sure? Lézare nodded. On the other side of the building, a crack of thunder erupted and a gust of wind blew. Chapter 14. Natalya studied the pale face with its fine, delicate lines. The elderly woman had come to mean so much to Natalya. She hated the thought of leaving her. I know what I'll do. I'll take her home. Okay, that would never work. Her father. All the questions. Fine, I'll get an apartment for her. She could do that. She could use her credit cards, and she had an account her father put money in, money she had hardly touched in months. Gone were the days of Michael Kors, Jimmy Choo, Chanel, and Armani. The sound of the door opening then closing with a soft click caught her attention. Probably Monica, here to check on Ms. Claudette. She wanted to thank Monica for making special allowances for the old woman. Natalya turned around. Lézare. She bit back a gasp. He glanced at Ms. Claudette, then turned his piercing gaze back to Natalya. You have to stop leaving me. His words were soft. You knew. That it was you? He stepped closer. I did, Cher. And you don't hate me. Hate you. That came from Ms. Claudette, but it was Elle's voice. Natalya's attention snapped to the older woman and the being that lived within her. This was far too complicated. How would she even begin to explain it? And, oh God, Ms. Claudette had connections to Lézare. Natalya would have to tell him about that. Of course he doesn't hate you, Alan continued. He's your mate. He's the one for you. Lézare had followed Natalya's scent deep into the homeless shelter. The hunter's block she'd taken had worn off, and the worry and fear in her scent were like a beacon, leading him straight to her. Why was she worried? What was she afraid of? He stopped in front of a door. Infirmary, the sign said. Natalya's scent stopped here. She was behind the paint-chipped, frosted glass door. He took the handle in hand and turned it gently, then slipped into the room and closed the door behind him with a soft click. Once inside, Lézare took a moment to study the old woman in the bed. Her brown eyes, wide and deep-set, remained glued on him. A blue flash appeared in their depths, and his mind immediately flew to May. The old woman had an elemental in her. What are the odds of encountering two elementals, after having gone an entire lifetime without meeting a single one? He thought of the gust of wind and the thunder. He turned his gaze to Natalya and drank her in. She was still beautiful, even with dark circles under her eyes from a lack of sleep, even wearing a dress that was badly wrinkled and sweat-stained after a long drive. The lush fabric clung to her curves, making it difficult for him to look away. Mon Dieu, his emotions for this white tigress were out of control. His tiger roared in disagreement, announcing his feelings for her were exactly what they should be. The sound of a throat clearing pulled him away from his thoughts, and just in time, because he couldn't guarantee his body wasn't going to respond to the emotions Natalya stirred in him. Natalya's head snapped in his direction. Her eyes wide, shocked to see him there. "You know," the voice said from the older woman's body. "You know what I am." He knew it wasn't the older woman. The voice was too young, too otherworldly. "I do," he told the elemental. "This is Miss Claudette," Natalya said. "And Alan." She paused. "Alan, why do you say that?" Natalya's face was crimson. "Because it's true, Cher. You don't deny it, do you? Let's not beat around the bush." I'm. The Natalya he knew had never stuttered or failed to find words. Nor had she ever blushed like this. Sure, he'd seen her face turn red in anger, but this was different. A shell-pink color kissed her cheeks. "She's related to you, you know." Natalya slapped her hand over her own mouth. The words seemed blurted. Clearly, she hadn't planned the exclamation. Lézare quirked a brow. He didn't want to go anywhere near the idea the old woman, lying in bed, was related to him. That was not possible. "Who is?" Natalya said, "Ms. Claudette." He frowned. He didn't believe she would deceive him. He could see conviction in her eyes. "Why do you say that?" "Because it's true." That was the voice of Alan. She continued, "She knew Céline Arsenault." He held back a reaction. Céline has been dead for many years now. She wasn't a shifter, though she bonded with Etienne, who was. And Claudette was but a little girl when she met Céline. "I should know. I was there." He crossed his arms over his chest. "How long have you been with her?" he asked Alan. "Since before she was born. I joined with Claudette while she was still in her mother's womb. Her mother was an octoroon who gave her child away. Claudette grew up in the Asile de l'Enfant, an orphanage started a few years before the Civil War began." "And how did she meet my great-great-grandmother?" "Céline used to go to the orphanage as a volunteer, after she and Etienne were wed, much to the chagrin of her father, who didn't understand why she couldn't give her time to more worthy causes than the abandoned children of the quadroons and octoroons who were kept by gentlemen in New Orleans' respectable society." He knew it was true, but he had to verify. "And why did Céline volunteer there?" "Because of Etienne. Because of all he'd been through." It was true. All of it. She had to be one of theirs. How did she end up here? Lézare had more questions. The historian in him wanted to probe and pry, but right now he had something far more important to handle. The spirited blonde who kept vanishing from his life. "Will you excuse us?" He was actually aiming the question at the old woman, more than the one who dwelled within her. He wasn't sure how much he trusted these beings. "I need to talk to May about this." He reached for Natalya's hand. "I'd like a moment with you." She'd been sitting by, watching them silently, a question in her eyes. She nodded. "Miss Claudette, I'll be back. Alan, do take care of her. And don't do anything to worry me." Natalya's voice was stern. Chapter 15. Natalya was still in state of shock, first at seeing Lézare, then at Elle's statement that she and Lézare were fated to be together. Now, at the story that was unfolding. She looked at Lézare's outstretched hand and put her own on top of it. His hand enveloped hers, covering it completely as he held it. A tingle began where their fingers met, and traveled up her arm and throughout her body. She bit her lip. Why was she so afraid? Because he'll hate me. A visit? He asked again. I'd like to talk to you. Uninterrupted. Yes. I know a place. Her father had a pontoon boat on Lake Travis. She could have them there in 30 minutes. I'll drive, he said, and held the door open for her. The sun was well up. It had been just after dawn when she'd arrived. She let him hold the door for her and gave him directions. He drove in silence, his eyes glued to the road. Natalya glanced at his profile now and then. She checked out his handsome face, his high cheekbones and short dark hair, the way his hands held the wheel with complete confidence, the way the muscles stood out on his thighs when he switched from the brake to the gas pedal. She memorized everything, every single little detail, because she was certain, no matter what Alan had said about them, he would be gone from her life once again. Finally, they arrived at the dock. He parked, got out, and held the door open for her. This is it. He pointed to the Marguerite. Yes. Named for my mother. She dug in her purse for the keys. Unless you wanted to be somewhere else. My father's house. A restaurant? You said you wanted privacy. This is fine. His smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. She slipped her heels off so she could get on the boat. He took her hand and helped her up and over the side. Then he followed her. I grew up only 8 hours from here. I know many of the shifters in the southern U.S. Why did I never see you or know about you before the incident with Vax? Natalya cringed at the mention of Vax, thinking of her childish antics in Dallas. I spent a lot of time in Europe. It seems I was too much of a handful. My father sent me to a private school after my mother was gone. No doubt you raised a little Cain there. Natalya didn't want to respond for fear he'd start to dwell on her behavior with Vax. God, that seems like a million years ago. Natalya unlocked the door of the cabin and slipped inside, opening 2 of the blinds facing the water, still affording them some privacy but giving them light and a view of the beautiful lake. She waved her arms around the place as if she were a game show hostess. We're here. Privacy. Now what? He was watching her. The muted morning sunlight made his eyes darker, and yet at the same time emphasized the amber glow of his tiger flashing in their depths. I should spank you for leaving me in the lurch. A shiver ran through her body. You've threatened that before. I recall. Does the idea repel you? More like excites me. I had to leave the ball. I got a text saying Ms. Claudette was in a bad way. I understand why you had to leave. But not the way it was handled. You should have come and talked to me. Lézare, how could I? After my behavior with you all those months ago. After my behavior with your cousin, your family. She felt the pinprick of tears and blinked them back. Say that again. He put a thumb on her bottom lip, his fingers holding her chin. Say what again? That I'm sorry? What is it you want me to say? My name. He leaned lower. His face approached hers in what felt like slow motion. Her breath was trapped in her lungs. He kissed her slowly, his tongue making languid swipes in her mouth, claiming her, taking her, not asking permission. He broke contact with her lips, pulling away just the slightest bit, his flesh emanating a warmth that filled her body with sensations she had never experienced before. Say it. I love the way you say it. She'd never said it aloud, not to him, not to anyone, though it was a sound she'd savored when she was alone. Saying his name so many times she would have willed his presence next to her if she'd had any magical powers. Lézare. Saying his name caressed her tongue, embraced her lips. Natalya. His voice was like nectar, making the way he said her name equal to a lover's touch. The southern lilt melded with the slight patois, an accent she'd come to associate only with him. What she said was true, you know. His words wreathed her heart, soothed her soul, and filled a part of her that had been hollow. She fought to breathe, to concentrate, so consumed was she by her desire for this man, for the way he pulled her into a place that felt like she was alone in the eye of a hurricane, but with the spotlight shining on her. Who? She barely managed to get the word out. Alan. What she said about us. You don't deny it, do you? Natalya licked her lip nervously, then sucked it into her mouth and chewed on it. It's my dream. She couldn't say that though. I'm going to give Ms. Claudette a home. Now where the hell did that come from? She hadn't planned to tell him. She hadn't even made a plan yet, not fully, but barely nebulous idea of what she wanted and didn't want for Ms. Claudette. What she didn't want was for that wonderful lady to be in a homeless shelter for the rest of her days. I can let you do that. He lowered himself into a chair and tugged on her hand, pulling her onto his lap. For some reason, it felt exactly right to be in his lap, the same as it had felt perfectly right to be in his arms dancing last night. Was it just last night? Why did it feel like so much more time had passed? Then the words he'd said a moment ago hit her. You can't let me do what? Miss Claudette. She should be with us. With family. An overwhelming sadness took hold of her. The pinpricks returned. This meant she wouldn't be able to see Miss Claudette, but at least she'd be happy and surrounded by those who would love her. Those who hate me. His sisters. You're right. She belongs with family. She fought the hot tears that threatened and stared out the window, watching a flock of birds as they surrounded a tall tree on the banks of a cove. She kept herself from glancing at him because it hurt her physically to look at him, to know she couldn't be with him. Not given the way his family would hate her, even if he seemed attracted to her. And you? I'll miss her, but I'll be happy for her. That's not what I meant. His hand was back, tilting her to face him. Are you going to deny what we have? Lézare. She swallowed hard, trying to bury the bitterness and sorrow of knowing she wouldn't have him, couldn't have him. I'm sorry. For what, Cher? His thumb touched her tear, then traced the path it had taken. The way I behaved toward you, your family. Vax. I can't blame them for hating me. They don't hate you. Ha. She couldn't help the smile she felt growing on her lips. Who are you kidding? I'd hate me. I do hate who I used to be. I thought you were a sexy spitfire. Angry at the world. Why were you so angry? What made that anger go away? Maybe because my mother left me. Then my father shipped me off to Europe. She turned her head out of his grasp, immediately missing the warmth of his fingers. Really, that's no excuse. There is no excuse for my behavior. You've changed. He regained his hold on her chin and angled her face toward his once more. For the better, I hope. I won't say I didn't want the woman I met all those months ago. I did. The tiger in me. He's been relentless about it too, almost as much as I have been. Natalya searched his eyes. How could he have wanted her back then? She waited for him to continue, wondering if the blade would fall, if the other shoe would drop. This woman you've become, though. His eyes held her captive, the golden flame she occasionally saw roaring to life in the depths of that darkness. Chapter 16. All the breath in her body abandoned her. Her heart pounded. Her tongue traced her bottom lip in anticipation. His thumb ran across it, capturing the lingering moisture her tongue left behind. His mouth lowered in a hard kiss, one very different from the tender dance their tongues had engaged in earlier. His tongue snaked in and took hers with an animal dominance. He tasted like freedom and sin, captivity and innocence all at the same time. The raw ultimatum in his kiss resulted in a searing pulse that flowed through her body and awakened her tigress with a fury that matched his tiger's. Need overwhelmed her, causing her to touch his chest, where she could feel the bunched, hard, taut muscles beneath the soft fabric of his shirt. His hand closed round hers, pressing it against his body, forcing her to feel the throbbing primal beat of his heart, in sync with the beat pulsing inside her body, a beat proclaiming her desire and screamed her need. She tore her hand free of his to run it downward. Relishing in the flexing muscles responding to her touch, She slipped her hand beneath the fabric, scoring his skin with her nails, running her fingers through the hair, broadcasting his maleness. A growl deep within his chest mirrored her own longings. She slid the fabric upward, higher and higher, until she'd pulled it over his head. Then she marveled at the latte-colored flesh beneath the shirt. She yielded to the urge, and lowered her lips to the tender spot between his neck and shoulder. A groan hoarse and raw was torn from him as she scraped her teeth across his flesh, letting her canines nick his skin, leaving behind a tiny trail that erupted into minuscule drops of blood. Who am I? She didn't recognize this part of her. She'd never been this way before. She was still in his lap, his hand on her hip holding her close, the hardness of his desire pressed against her thigh. He tugged her closer, and his other hand tangled in her long hair, twining it around his fist. Pressing his lips to her, he kissed her deeply, drawing her tongue into his mouth, sucking the flavor of his blood off of it. The pulse between her legs matched the beat of her heart and the snarls of her tigress. Passion unfurled, claiming both Natalya and her beast. She heard the sound and recognized it immediately, the rending of fabric giving way to the sharpness of claws. She knew at once he'd unsheathed his. That was followed by the sensation of air cooling her exposed skin, as the dress fell away from her body and draped her lap. The swell of lust trailed behind, picking her up in its waves and carrying her to another place. Lézare. Her voice was wispy, delicate tendrils of fog floating just above the water's surface before the sun could dissipate it completely. Natalya, you are mine. The throatiness of his growl was a dam holding back the power of destruction, completion, and even resurrection. I am. There had been no question in his statement, and there was no doubt in her reply. It was as if she'd never breathed before Lézare. Her murmured words seemed to spur him to action. He stood up from the chair, holding her against him, settling at their feet on the shiny wood flooring. He glanced around the luxurious cabin, then made for the upholstered bench seat. There'll be no more running away from me. He took a seat on the bench, flipped her over his lap, face down, her luscious ass skyward. No more running. She whispered, her voice tinged with anticipation. She was turned on. She couldn't deny it. His hard cock pressed against her body, teasing her with what he had to offer. Her breathing grew irregular when he pulled her panties down just enough to bare her ass. What are you doing? What I promised. To spank that delicious derriere of yours, Cher. She struggled, though desire pooled between her legs. Lézare threw one leg over hers, keeping her in place. You think you're in charge? She panted the words out in short bursts of breaths. With one hand on her ass, searing her flesh, the other slid down the crease between her ass and thigh, tracing so lightly he left tiny goosebumps on her skin. When he slipped his fingers against her folds, the tips feather-stroking her swollen lips, her muscles tightened with arousal. Her back arched against her will, and yet completely in line with her desires. Very much so, Cher. With a flattened hand, he tapped her ass, the impact making her breath catch. The sting followed the burn. He massaged her tender skin with one hand, while the other hand teased her pussy lips, touching them ever so lightly then pushing in. Desire batted indignation within her. And yet his fingers continued, massaging, slipping in, going out, bringing her juices out and slickening her lips, then back in. Then out. In. Out. Her back arched again, her ass pushed ever upward. Still trapped beneath his leg, her thighs tried to spread to take more of his fingers in. The hand massaging her ass rose and dropped swiftly. A fierce smack that made a high squeal slip out. Her muscles tightened around his fingers. His groan was her reward, though her tender flesh stung with intensity. Please? Her voice was distorted with passion and pain. Please? Please what, Cher? His fingers plunged in deeply. His hand dropped on her ass with a sharp tap. That was her undoing. A crunching and stretching sound yielded to her shifting. Within seconds she was in her white tigress form, snarling and turning to face Lézare. She stepped back. He'd shifted along with her. He was a huge white tiger, majestic, deep-chested and broad-shouldered. His eyes flashed a deep dark brown, a golden glow in their depths. He snarled and pushed on her to establish a sync, the way shifters communicated, creating a link that allowed them to speak within their minds. "We weren't done, Cher." She cocked her head, studied his tiger. "My tigress was done." He laughed in their synced link, a soft laugh, sexy and at the same time challenging. He stalked closer, though they were already in crowded quarters. She swatted at him with her claws extended, semi-playful. She didn't intend to hurt him, and she wasn't sure she could anyway. His tiger was massive. "I like the fire in you." He put his head against her withers, just above her shoulders, and opened his tiger's mouth, gripping her neck. "Shift back so I can make love to you, or I'll mount you in your tigress form. And Cher, I want to do so much more to you than that." Natalya didn't think she could have fallen more in love with Lézare than she had, but she was wrong. His words, his actions, everything he was sent her to the next level. She shifted quickly and faced him. He was still in his tiger form, an incredible feline. She reached her hand out, buried her fingers in his fur, and leaned close, letting luxurious fur touch her face. Seconds later, he shifted into his human form. "Cher, I want you." He picked her up, set her on the seat, and she raised up so he could pull her panties over her hips, then down her thighs and completely off. "Open your legs." His command, explicit and blunt, had her heart pounding. She parted her legs. His eyes seared as he stared, branding her as his. She closed her eyes against the intensity and yearning behind them. She heard him lower himself and concentrated on the sound of the water lapping and the image of the man in front of her, muscular, handsome, and completely hers, forever. The warmth of his breath caressed her inner thighs, and she flinched as if she'd been burned. His fingers on each knee pressed insistently, opening her legs even more. Without warning, his fingers slid in. Natalya released a small sound, part protest, part pleasure, and all beseeching, wanting Lézare, needing him. He began to stroke her with an in-and-out rhythm that had her channel gripping his moisture-slickened finger, her hips writhing for more. One finger was joined by another, delving deep with the ruthless and relentless objective of delivering pleasure. Then his mouth closed over her clit, and he sucked in deeply, claiming the swollen nub. For a moment, Natalya's cries drowned out every other sound. "I have to have you." His voice was raspy, the tiger in it reaching out to capture the tigress within her. The explosion of sensations and the starbursts behind her eyelids made her grab his shoulders. She dug her nails in deep as her body clenched around his strong fingers, spasming with each thrust. Frenzied cascades of ecstasy culminated in a scream that was lost in his mouth as his lips secured hers in a kiss. Natalya opened her eyes to find the tiger in his, a strong golden glow that suffused her tigress with warmth. She tasted herself on his lips, savoring the salty earthiness of her slickness. Lézare pulled her toward him, his roughness bringing her back from what felt like a whirlpool, closer to a new realm of pleasure. He thrust forward into her, and a delicious pain sizzled inside, eliciting a new sound from her throat, the husky howl of her tigress's release. He ground against her, then began to move at a rapid, wild pace, pulling out and pushing deep, enveloping himself over and over while her flesh fought to keep him from drawing away by tightening fiercely around him. His back arched and a harsh sound left his lips. His grip was like steel, clutching her to him as his orgasm pulsed deep within her, catching her off guard and sending her spiraling into her own climax. With a speed that could only be attributed to his tiger, Lézare's lips latched onto her neck and he sank his teeth into her flesh. She gasped as the instant of pain transformed to a flush of pleasure that forced a shiver throughout her body. He pushed off but remained inside her and held her at arm's length. A smile, slow and wicked, emerged on his face. "You won't be running from me again, Lézare." Natalya's voice was soft as the depth of his love infused her. "I told you I was yours. I'm taking no chances with you, tigress." He lapped at the tiny, quickly healing wounds he'd left at the base of her neck. Lézare watched her sleep. She'd barely been able to keep her eyes open after he'd couple bonded with her. She'd laid her head on his shoulder, and before he knew it, tiny bursts of breath were escaping from her parted lips every time her chest rose and fell. He'd moved aside and let her take the bench seat, covering her with a sheet he'd found in a drawer nearby. This was the woman he loved, and he had her. His chest filled with joy. His spirit was renewed. He'd never fully comprehended how empty his life had been until now, until this very moment, as he reflected on how much she meant to him. He texted Theo, told him to call his attorney and make any and all necessary steps to ensure there were no obstacles to giving Claudette Dunnington a grant so she could have her own money. He called Alexa, but it rolled over to her voicemail. That didn't surprise him. She'd been up late with the ball after all, and it wasn't quite time for the brunch. Sacre bleu, I've missed the ball and now I'll miss the brunch. This was a first. Lézare never shirked his responsibilities to his family or their obligations to the Shifter community. Hopefully, Alexa had fulfilled his role. He looked at Natalya again and realized it was all worth it. Of course, he'd have to smooth things out with his sisters, get them to see who Natalya really was. That shouldn't be a problem. I hope. With any luck, Valencia had shown up without a problem. And Evie hadn't killed Mason Martinez. I picked a fine time to leave town. He dialed Vax's number. How's my nephew, or is that cousin twice removed? I think I'd rather to call him my nephew. At the other end, Vax laughed. He's thriving. And sleeping. So is his mother. Where are you? Austin. I'll be home later this evening. Would you make sure May and Doc Don leave? I have someone I want May to meet. Sure. Who? An elemental. Austin. Do I need to ask why you are in Austin? Vax paused. Do I need to ask why? I'll catch you up when I get home. I have another call or two to make. Lézare tapped the end icon on his phone. One more thing to do. He dialed the homeless shelter and talked to the woman named Monica who'd let him in early this morning. He told her he was a relative of Ms. Claudette, and he was going to take her to Arsenault Point, and there'd be no need to worry about her. Your family? Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad. I'll be by later on this afternoon to pick her up. It's time for her to go home. If only I'd known much earlier. You're something else, Lézare Arsenault. Natalya's voice was sleep husky and sexy. His head snapped in her direction. When did you wake up? A smile crept onto her face, a gentle smile, one that made her eyes light up. She pulled the sheet higher with a touch of modesty that made her even sexier. He felt a stirring in his pants. Damn. This woman. He sighed. A few moments ago. So you heard my conversations? She nodded. You didn't hear the one I haven't had yet. Which one is that? She looked puzzled, her brows dipping into a tiny V. The one where I call your father and tell him you're mine. A delicate pink laced her cheeks. I like the sound of that. She cocked her head, a half smile on her lips. Then suddenly, the smile vanished. My father. I need to tell him where I am. Not to worry. She jumped to her feet, the sheet wrapped around her. He knows. She froze. What? When he couldn't find you, he called me. He thought after the way we'd returned you all those months ago, we could do the same thing again. She shoved her hair out of her face impatiently and chewed on her lip. He really needs to stop treating me like I'm his little girl. He's just worried. I told him I'd found you and that you were fine. She nodded. About Ms. Claudette. You're coming with me. You're living at Arsenault Point. Was that a question? She teased him, her eyes glittering dangerously. Would it matter if it was? He rose from the chair and stalked toward her, danger and lust in his eyes.
Chapter 17. Lézare was driving. In the back seat, Miss Claudette was napping. They were almost at Arsenault Point. He handed Natalya his phone. Call Vax. He has a new son. Callie just gave birth. At your house. During the ball. Yes. They named him Eli. Healthy little boy. I'm happy for him. She bit back the urge to cry at the misery she'd created for Vax and his family. She should apologize, do something, say something. Lézare. You have to forgive yourself, Cher. They'll forgive you. In this world, there has to be mercy and compassion, especially for the repentant. He pointed toward the phone. She nodded, then pressed Vax's name and handed Lézare the phone. Can you meet me at your cabin and bring May? Callie's still staying in the main house, right? A pause, then he continued, just May for now. Don't tell anyone else, especially my sisters. Not yet. Natalya knew why he'd said not to tell his sisters. He was seeking to avoid the fireworks. But why did he want May there? Earlier on the boat, I heard you say you hadn't. She glanced back at Claudette, whose eyes were closed. Was she sleeping? Could she say the word elemental? No, she didn't want to take a chance. I heard you say you had someone you wanted May to meet. Lézare glanced in the rearview mirror. He was probably worried about the same thing, Miss Claudette overhearing. May's just like. He indicated the back seat with a nod of his head. Natalya had questions, but they'd have to wait until they were alone. Arsenault Point's drive came into view, but he passed it. She glanced at him, wondering what he was doing. Avoiding the main house for now, Lézare said. He took the next right and drove down a lane surrounded by trees, in a tight formation, blocking the view to anything but the road in front and the road behind. He pulled into a clearing in which stood several old cabins. Natalya hadn't grown up in the area, but she knew what the cabins were. They'd been the homes of slaves in days past. But why were they still standing? My great-great-grandfather Etienne's home, before he left to make a new life for himself. He paused, then added, elsewhere. Her curiosity piqued. She wanted to ask questions, but Lézare had parked and turned the engine off, and Vax and May were coming out of the cabin on the far right. Miss Claudette were here, Lézare said, then climbed out the vehicle. He opened the door for Natalya, then held it open for Miss Claudette. Vax's eyes landed on Natalya. What? Lézare saw Natalya flinch at Vax's reaction. He put his arm around her. I'll explain later. Vax nodded. She leaned into him, as if seeking to gain strength. He squeezed her against his body, reminding her they were in this together, that there was nothing to fear. Then he turned toward May. I wanted you here because of Miss Claudette. She's a distant cousin by marriage. Natalya found her in Austin. We brought her home. May looked at Claudette, then focused on Claudette's eyes. A flash of indigo appeared in May's eyes. Dark clouds rolled in. Alan. May's voice didn't sound human. It had an ethereal quality to it. Lézare knew it was her elemental speaking. Natalya stared. Benneth. That was Alan's voice. You know each other? Natalya asked. Claudette took Natalya's hand, but Alan was the one who spoke. We go way back. Before May, before Claudette. In another century, on another continent. I haven't seen her in ages, Benneth explained to Natalya, then turned toward Alan. I haven't seen you for at least 200 years. Certainly not in this body. True. Not since. Alan paused. How is Circe? May's expression changed. The indigo flame in the back of her dark eyes vanished. I wouldn't know. And her voice changed. She was May again. Though I'll find out later. I'm going to see her. A pause. And the Order of Elementals. I'll be making the trip with Astra. That will be an interesting reunion. Perhaps I should consider a visit, Alan said. Maybe after I find a new. She sighed. Claudette is getting older, and her mate was not a shifter. She won't have the longevity you seem to have. Lézare turned toward Vax. Miss Claudette has graciously agreed to be our guest here at Arsenault. I'd like to think that somewhere above, Etienne and Celine are smiling down on us. A slow grin came to his face. I think she'll be just what my sisters will need. Your sisters? Vax began. What? Evie isn't doing well with Mason being here. I think Alexa is distracted. Vax glanced at Natalya. Perhaps as you have been distracted. Natalya took a deep breath. Vax, I want to apologize to you and Callie. I know you can't possibly forgive me. Vax put his hand on her arm. You are Lézare's mate. You've couple bonded. He's my cousin. He exhaled. That's enough for me. Callie will agree completely. Trust me. There has to be room for forgiveness. I've seen too much of the chasms that can develop within families. We don't want that. Thank you. Natalya's eyes brimmed with tears. Lézare kissed her on the temple. See. All is well at Arsenault Point. Your sisters. Her voice was a wisp on the heavy, humid air. Don't worry about my sisters. They'll see what you are to me, what I am to you. Trust me. Lézare thumbed away an errant tear, leaving a lazy trail over her cheekbone. Let's get Miss Claudette settled in her room. He glanced at his watch. Looks like I've missed brunch. Are all the guests gone? Many have remained. They're staying to see you, Vax said. Well then, let's get to the main house. I have an announcement to make. Epilogue. Lézare stood at the top of the staircase, his arm around Natalya. He scanned the assembled shifters, still in masquerade garb. 3 faces which should be there were not: Alexa, Evie, Valencia. He didn't let his concern show, and forced a smile to his face. I hope everyone has had a good time. Catcalls, hooting and clapping interrupted him. His smile grew more genuine. This was an annual Arsenault event, and tradition mattered to him, though he'd had to break it to find his true mate. He glanced at her, gave her a tiny wink. A soft blush kissed her cheeks. It's been a momentous escape weekend, one I'm sure my ancestors, especially Etienne, would have been proud. I found my mate. He kissed Natalya on the cheek. More catcalls ensued. He laughed and waved them off, smiled, and waited for the din to die down. My cousin Vax. He waved toward Vax. And his beautiful mate have added to our family. Elias Raphael Tiero. Shortly, we'll be serving mimosas. Appetizers too. You're welcome to stay as long as you like. In the back, sitting in a chair, Claudette smiled at him, her elemental shining indigo in her eyes. Lézare offered her a half bow and turned toward Natalya. I think I should dance with cousin Claudette. She smiled as she tucked a stray lock behind her ear. You absolutely should. I love you, Cher. I'm so happy. Tears flooded her green eyes. I love you too. A new age was coming to Arsenault Point, and Lézare had been waiting for this for a long time.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by Elle Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.